It is our pleasure to be hosting this evening, asking the question 6 months on, what have we learned? Where are we at as a country? Are there lessons to continually be learned? My name is Andy Burns, and I am the director of a charity called Capital Mass. If you'd like to know more about Capital Mass, you can grab me over the drinks towards the end. One of our team, Angela Afzal, is just here as well, so if you are part of the Diocese of London and would like to know how your parishes can engage in the refugee response, then please see her as well after drinks. We want to give a special thanks to JustShare for the ability to host this evening. Particular thanks to Tricia, who's coordinated the event, and to St Mary's Le Beau for your generous hospitality in allowing us to have this here. In the panel tonight, we have the Right Reverend David Earl, who is the Bishop of Manchester, so it is good to be joined by a fellow Northerner, of which we've both been repeatedly told to speak slowly whilst here. Something I've been trying for the past 20 years as a Southerner to master. Forgive me if I've not quite succeeded yet. He has been the Bishop of Manchester since 2013. Prior to that, the Bishop of Dudley from 2000, and then before that involved in parish ministries and industrial chaplaincy in the Diocese of Sheffield, and it's fantastic to have you with us. Also this evening we have Emily Bowerman, who is the Programmes Manager for Refugee Support Network, which runs the higher education programme, helping young refugees and asylums seek and access university whilst here. So this evening we're going to have 2 inputs from our guest speakers, around 10 to 15 minutes each. After both have spoken, we'll have about 20-25 minutes worth of Q&A from yourselves to ask further questions as we explore this topic further. So without further ado, so you don't have to listen to my dulcet tones, can I please invite the Bishop of Manchester, if he would like to come up and offer his remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Once again, invitation to be here with you tonight. I've been involved with speaking on issues around refugees and around the wider migration issue for about 3 or 4 years now, and one thing I've discovered in that quite quickly is you can learn a lot from your hate mail. People who care enough to have got angry by what I've said or spoken on the television or written in the newspapers usually have a point to make. Almost everybody who writes me a rude or an abusive email or a letter does actually get a personal response from me. I say almost everybody. I did get, at the height of the issues in the press around September time, a postcard with on one side of it a lovely picture of the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh in a horse-drawn carriage. I don't think it was from them. The other side contained 50 words. It was anonymous. It was all in capital letters. It managed to be homophobic, anti-Semitic, Islamophobic. My only regret was it failed to be sexist. It didn't get the clean sweep. But it gave me nothing to respond to and no return address anyway. Often when I respond to somebody who's approached me in that kind of way, abusively, rudely, aggressively, once I've shown I've understood their point and indicated where and why I agree or disagree, I then get a second email or letter, much less angry, and you're often quite apologetic for the tone of the original one. We agree to differ, but we both learn. When I've had a dozen of emails, I'm able to pull out the recurrent themes. So what I want to make the moral case around refugees and what we can do, at least in part by reference to the ways in which I've been attacked for promoting that case. And the first thing is about the difference between the wider issues around migration. I'm glad the BBC seem to have started using the refugee word again. For a while they seem to have stopped using it. Everybody was being called migrants, and that's not a fair assimilation. What of the mail I get that's aggressive or abusive tells me that Britain is full up. But it soon becomes clear, if they say more than that they're really speaking primarily of, for example, the 320,000 net migrants into the UK in the latest 12-month period figures. shortage of housing, jobs that are not available for local people. They're often cited, but it's not. So I get letters telling me that there's no housing, that there's no jobs because of refugees, but it's not actually refugees. There is a wider debate to be held about migration, but that's not what we're here to talk about tonight. And that's often not what I've been talking about when I've received the letters and the emails. The failure to recognise that there is a distinct issue around refugees is a very grievous failure. I can, and I do elsewhere, make that economic case for the benefits of migration, and indeed research just published a couple of days ago shows that even among the lowest paid homegrown workers, the net impact of migration on wage levels is so minimal that it's hardly there at all. But for many people, the debate isn't about economics. It's not. You will have a chance to ask your questions when we finish speaking, sir. Thank you. We will take questions at the end. Thank you. That's the protocol for this evening. Please ask questions at the end, as other people will do. But I think we do need to speak. It's important we speak of Britain's obligations to international undertakings, treaties that in many cases, in the years after the Second World War, we were a founder signatory to. There's a moral case to keep the promises that we've made, a moral case not to withdraw from those promises, and because to do that would also open the floodgates for others who wish to abrogate treaties. Because we're a founder of many of those treaties, we have a particular responsibility to sustain them. That's not especially a religious argument, but humanitarianism has its roots profoundly in religion. The second theme of the letters and emails I get is that, yes, my views will destroy British values and British society. That's an argument which has drawn some strength in the last couple of weeks from the New Year events in Germany. I've been warned in emails that in 30 years' time, all of England's cathedrals will be mosques, and that you and I will be living under Sharia law. So the question is, should I do a morally evil thing to refuse to help the needy, because that will achieve a longer-term good thing, or prevent some other possible evil? It's one of the most ancient moral challenges that all philosophies and religions have had to face. Do you do evil that good might ensue? But here we are on more obviously religious ground, because Christianity again and again says no. The ends don't justify the means. The story of the temptation of Jesus in the wilderness makes that very clear. But again, I don't accept the argument that the numbers of refugees that we're talking about taking in this country, whether we're talking 20,000 as the government have proposed or 50,000 as the bishops are urged, whether we're talking about that is, I think you're not talking refugees, sir. I think you're talking... Even at the figures that the bishops have proposed, we're talking about less than one person in 1,000. We're talking, as I've said, about refugees. The bishops have suggested maybe the country could take over 5 years 50,000 refugees from Syria. The government have suggested 20,000. Even on that larger figure, we're talking less than one new person for every 1,000, not a number that will change radically the nature of our society, I would suggest. The next area of challenge is basically the statement that charity not only begins at home, but ends at home. I'm asked, why am I not putting all my energy into doing something about homelessness and poverty here in the UK among the indigenous settled population? I would say, though, it is not an either-or debate. People who say that clearly haven't followed what I write and do about rough sleeping. I was preparing a piece on the train coming to London this afternoon for Homelessness Sunday, and committed to a sleep out in Manchester later this year to raise money for the Church Urban Fund. The churches in Manchester have recently set up a new winter shelter scheme. The argument sometimes is that until every aspect of domestic poverty has been eradicated, we should do nothing to support outsiders. That's not an attitude we take to any other area of spending. We don't say until all the children have been educated, we don't have hospitals. We don't say until everybody's illnesses have been cured, we don't have pensions. We don't say until every pensioner is comfortable, we don't have schools. Anyway, Jesus has a very clear view about how realistic it is to entirely wipe out poverty. And he's right. Poverty will always be with us. We must tackle it on every front. We must tackle human need on every front, including the need of those who flee from terror and war and end up on our shores. And sometimes the argument comes with the suggestion that if I think helping refugees is a moral issue, then I should fund it by emptying the church's pockets. Again, churches have a wide and varied programme of moral response to social issues. Church funds enable that to be maintained in a sustainable fashion. When I'm asked why the church commissioners don't spend all their capital on combating homelessness or other social evils, I explain that spending their money on those things is exactly what they're doing. They do it by such things as providing the network of clergy in poorer areas who can then sustain a level of engagement with those issues far beyond what simply spending out the reserves in one go would ever achieve. Particularly since Paris, I've had letters saying that refugees are basically infiltrated by terrorists. I think in responding to that, I need to emphasise that Europe's terrorists, whether those in Paris last year or those in London a decade before, are almost entirely homegrown. They're people who have lived many years, usually born and brought up in Europe or the UK. Moreover, members of oil revenue-funded terrorist networks, if that's who we're fearing, are not going to be blocked from access to Europe or the UK by measures to keep out refugees. They have different means of getting in. They require a different security system to identify and prohibit them.
The risky refugees.
Thank you. I think it's an important issue, and what we need to remember is that refugees, asylum seekers are no more perfect or less perfect than anybody else. There is no evidence to suggest that crime is disproportionately committed by refugees, asylum seekers or migrants. I know that one event got badly out of hand, and I know some people who were refugees were involved in committing criminal acts, and I do not in any way condone that. I don't accept your figures, sir. What are the churches doing? Yes, we are engaging with refugee issues. We're working, certainly in Manchester, with existing respected organisations who've been around a long time, who know the refugee communities and can help direct new arrivals to the right sort of support that's available for them. The Prime Minister was saying earlier today about the importance of people learning English. I go to a number of churches in my diocese and find language classes there where church volunteers are doing precisely that. They're helping people who've come to this land who want to learn the English tongue to learn it. Those people, we've always more enthusiastic people wanting to learn English than we have people to teach them. What we've looked to the Prime Minister to do, if he thinks English is important, is to fund the training and the oversight that will support those volunteers in their work. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for listening as best we've been able to do. I think the churches are very much engaged with these issues, but they are, as we've heard, very politically divisive issues. I think we owe a very strong moral duty to those who are fleeing war, fleeing terror, coming to our shores. They will benefit us as previous groups who've come as refugees from Uganda, from Vietnam, as elsewhere have always done. My city, Manchester, would not be the vibrant, thriving city it is without people who have come to it as refugees over 200 years. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Bishop David, there'll be opportunities in the next 15-20 minutes to ask any questions. Can I just ask that the floor would give respect to the speakers? If you have questions, you can ask them at the end. And that's when we'll have that time, which will be open, and I will be fair and equal to all who wish to ask questions. I'd like to invite Emily up from the charity Refugee Support Network, who's going to give her comments on this theme.
Thank you. I want to begin with Hamid's story, in his own words. I came to the UK from Afghanistan when I was 16 years old. The reason was the conflict, which resulted in losing both my parents. First, I had to face the pain of losing my parents, the lonely journey, then which had no direction. I mean, I didn't know where I was going, only to run for the safety of my life. And now I had to lose education, which was the only hope that kept me going to succeed, the desire to become a useful, independent person in society. Hamid was put into the care system. He learnt English and he studied hard. He hoped to apply to university, but he had problems doing so because he still didn't have permanent leave to remain in the UK. He continues his story. At that point, I felt on the edge of disaster. Refugee Support Network helped me communicate my situation to the university and apply for extra financial support. I started thinking that there is someone in my life who can listen to me and understand me. This was a great turning point. I finally managed to find my way to Brighton University, where I'm now in my second year studying engineering. I'm extremely thankful to the kind people who guided me during this process and gave me reasons to dream again. Finally, I would like to send a strong message to all those who have had the same issue as me, that there is still hope. Refugee Support Network exists for young people like Hamid, who have come to the UK seeking safety from conflicts and crises around the world. These young people have often lost family and friends, made long journeys as children by themselves, and face uncertain futures. We want them to know that there is still hope. We want them to know that they have futures that are worth investing in and preparing for, and we do this by supporting them to move forward in their education. Tonight, we've been asked to reflect on the refugee crisis, 6 months on. But for Refugee Support Network, the presence of refugees is not a new thing. We've been going for 6 years, and during that time, we've got to know young people from places like Eritrea, Iraq, Afghanistan, and now Syria, many of the places that we see on the news. A couple of thousand children arrive in the UK by themselves each year seeking asylum, and we're currently working with about 200 of them. Refugees aren't a new thing, but the last 6 months have been different. I think the scale is different, the media coverage and public awareness is different, and the response has been different. The government's pledge to resettle 20,000 Syrian refugees in the coming 5 years is raising lots of very practical questions about the UK's role in responding to displaced people on our doorstep. So as we look back at the last 6 months, I'd like to share 3 things that I've learnt through my role at Refugee Support Network. Firstly, we've learnt that investing in individual young people does make a difference. The unfolding refugee crisis can make us feel really powerless. It's hard to know where to start and hard to believe that investing in one person at a time can really make a difference. However, I believe it does, and I'd like to tell you about someone. Theodore is 18 and comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo, in a region where armed groups regularly attack civilians. When he was a child, his family fled an attack in his village and settled in a camp for internally displaced people. Theodore's father and mother were killed in a spate of violence, and he fled again on his own. He travelled by land through several African countries, and after journeying for 18 months, ended up in the UK. He suffered from flashbacks of the violence he'd experienced and found it hard to sleep. With a bit of extra support, he got a place in an English class, and he was given a volunteer educational mentor, just a regular person who had decided to give an hour a week to support a young person who was alone in the UK. A year on, and Theodore's confidence has grown, his insomnia has reduced, and he's made progress with his studies. And his mentor has been changed and encouraged through the process. We have learnt that investing in individuals like Theodore does make a difference. Secondly, we've seen that there is a lot of generosity out there. It's all too easy to see the negative descriptions and treatment of those seeking safety in the UK. And just this morning on the news, there was a story about the houses of asylum seekers in Middlesbrough being targeted with violence. But in the last 6 months, and after many years of pushing back against this kind of language and behaviour, at Refugee Support Network, we've seen another trend, that of generosity. We've seen schools really thinking through how to be as welcoming as possible to Syrian children. We've seen universities creating bursaries for refugee students. We've seen children donating their pocket money to help other children who've been displaced. And as an organisation, we've been inundated by people wanting to help in some way. Lee Jin is a teenager from North Korea. She remembers seeing children and elderly people dying in the streets from famine. We are not human in North Korea, she told us. I can't speak here about her escape from North Korea and her journey to the UK, but it's enough to say for now that she's an inspiring girl who's overcome incredible odds. She recently shared her story at an event where, unbeknownst to her, one of the guests was a doctor. When she spoke about her own dream of becoming a doctor, he wondered what he could do to help. He offered her a week of work experience, taking a week of his own annual leave to accompany her through the process. She's written on our blog really effusively about how life-changing that experience was for her, but it wouldn't have been possible if this man hadn't chosen to be generous. So we've learnt that investing in individual young people does make a difference, and we've learnt that there's a lot of generosity out there. But I think we'll all agree that this raises lots of questions. Yes, investing in individuals is good, but can we really do that for everyone? Yes, generosity is good, but surely resources are finite. And I know that I'm not immune to those questions either. Recently, I was reading an article exhorting us all to share our spare rooms with refugees. Working in the charity sector and struggling to find somewhere affordable to live in London myself, I admit to feeling real anxiety about this, knowing that I can barely afford a room of my own, let alone a spare one. So I certainly don't want to oversimplify the issues, but the third thing I've learnt in the last 6 months is that yes, the refugee crisis is complex, but everyone can play a part in responding to it. For Hamid from Afghanistan, what he needed was accurate advice and support to enable him to get to university. For Theodore from DRC, it took a volunteer mentor whose investment of care and time has made him feel known and valued and more confident. For Lee Jin from North Korea, it was the doctor who saw her aspirations and realised that it was within his power to do something to help her. Each of these resilient and unique young people was able to move forward with their lives thanks to other people deciding to act. Doing something looks different for everyone. For some people, it will involve mentoring a young person or giving them an opportunity they wouldn't otherwise have. For others, it will be giving money to support programs like these. For some, it will be advocating for particular policies. For others, it will be a determination to use language more generously in a way that will benefit them. A couple of days ago, I went to a solicitor's appointment with a boy from Afghanistan who, although he's been in the UK for many years, is still going through the asylum process and is scared that he may one day be sent back there. He's had a rough few weeks and is wondering where he's going to end up. In the waiting room, he looked with excitement at the photos of my colleague's new baby, and it was a welcome distraction from some of the things he was worrying about. As we were talking, I told him that I was coming here this evening, and I asked him what I should say. I said, what would you tell us all? And he started talking about the people who have helped him along the way. A sofa to sleep on, a piece of timely advice, a kind word. And then he said, tell them that one person can't do everything alone, but it is important that everyone does something. Thank you.
Very much, Emily, for your input there. And now to the time in the programme where there's an opportunity to ask questions. We want to have as many of those questions as we possibly can. And if you've got one specifically for one of the speakers, if you could just highlight that, that would be great. If not, I will ask one of them to respond to your questions. So if I could have a question from the gentleman at the back.
Yes. I want to talk about the democratic legitimacy of what the Bishop and this young lady are promoting. When were the British people ever asked if they wanted their nation to become a multiracial society? We never were. I direct you people to read a book by the historian Andrew Roberts, a book called Eminent Churchillians, and the last chapter of this was dealing with this, whether you call them immigrants or refugees. What they are is alien people coming into our nation. And he discussed how the Conservative government then started off with Winston Churchill's government at the beginning of the immigration influx into our country, and how Sir Cyril Osborne, who wanted to raise a motion in the House of Commons, was oppressed by his own party into shutting up on that very issue. And that chapter of that book ends with Andrew Roberts commentating that the greatest single demographic change in the history of the British nation for the last 1,000 years was accomplished without any democratic ratification whatsoever. The British people were never asked whether they wanted to live in a multiracial society, and because we are now oppressed by Race Relations Act and all the rest of it, they've imposed on us something we never asked for, and then they passed laws, trying to criminalise our point of view. And this is
I have your question, thank you.
when do you think the rest that you built up, you've been piling logs onto this nation's funeral pyre, do you really wish to destroy?
Okay, you've asked your question, thank you. And I ask that you would allow each person, if they have something to comment back to you, whether you agree with that or not, with the questions that are...
Happy to respond. We have a democratic government. We can vote for political parties. Anybody who wishes to stand for Parliament is, providing they're over the age and meet the general qualifications, most of us do, are entitled to do so and to seek our votes. That's how the British people are governed. That's how we determine the way in which our society goes forward. If we don't like what a political party has done, we can throw them out of the next election and elect another one. I still hold to the view that the diversity of the society in which I live is a blessing, not a curse. That the richness that people who've come from different parts of the world to make their homes here and to live peaceably among us is something that is a great benefit to our society. In Manchester recently, we've been very proud with the discovery of graphene. We've got the Graphene Institute being set up. I was speaking with one of the people who'd led on that research programme, born in Moscow, but yet making his home in Manchester, producing a piece of development and invention that will add greatly to the wealth of this country. All the evidence shows that the diversity of our land, which has been the case for many, many centuries, is its strength, not its weakness. Let's build that sort of country. That is the sort of country, whatever party we vote for, the vast majority of us are voting to be part of.
I definitely agree with the Bishop, but I think it's also helpful to go back to something he said in his initial talk about the fact that terminology does actually matter. And although there are big debates to be had about migration more generally, what we're particularly thinking about tonight is the issue of the refugee crisis, because within a larger group of migrants, and I don't want to paint a picture of refugee good, other migrants bad, but I think we need to recognise that when we're speaking about refugees, we are speaking about a very particular group of people who are fleeing persecution in countries where it's not safe for them to be. So I think in contexts like this, it is worth clarifying the use of the terminology while recognising that I think it is really important to have some of these larger debates about those wider terms.
Question from the gentleman at the back in the blue.
My name's Robert Henderson. Sorry, can you all hear me now?
Yes.
Right. Yep. My name's Robert Henderson. I run the Living in a Madhouse blog, and I'll be writing a report of this meeting to go up shortly. My friend here has raised, all right, I know he may have been a little bit belligerent and this sort of thing, but he does have a point that there wasn't any contrary voice on your panel. Now, I wonder, and I'll come to a question fairly rapidly, I wonder exactly how far the panel members actually realize what they're playing with. They're playing with fire. Last year, the think tank British Future produced research on British attitudes to immigration, and they found something like 70% wanted no more immigration, and even more incredibly in these politically correct times, 25% wanted every immigrant already in the country to be returned.
So can I ask what your question is?
No, just a moment. Now, it's all very well and good for people like you to say, play the bleeding heart, say we must be nice to everything, but we are in a camp of the saints scenario. Now, the camp of the saints...
Can I just ask what your question is, please, sir?
Well, if you can bear with me for another 30 seconds or so, I'll give it to you.
I'll give you 10.
Right. Well, all right, 10. But I mean, the camp of the saints is a rather important issue. It was a novel written by a Frenchman who actually depicted exactly what is happening now, which is hordes of immigrants coming to the shores of the Mediterranean.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, let me give you the question.
Well, ask the question then, please, sir.
Well,
You're not. You're trying now to make a point. Ask the question.
My question is, why should there not be a referendum so the British people can have a say on whether they want any more immigration?
Thank you. That's a fair question. I will ask that here.
We use referendums very sparingly in this country. I think that we have a representative form of democracy. We elect those who represent us in the House of Commons, and they then make those decisions on our behalf, and we throw them out if we're not happy with what they're doing. That is our polity in this country. Other countries have different systems regarding referendums. That is our polity.
My suggestion on the back of that would be to ask your MP if that could be brought up, if that is a matter that is of great importance. Could I ask the lady in the red cardigan there a question?
I'm a member of Population Matters. Now, if there were fewer people, we would have less of a problem of refugees or migrants. This is something which people are very, very reluctant to take on board, but there are just too many of us, and everything possible must be done to help people to regulate the size of their families.
Are we talking UK or worldwide?
They can afford them, and they can educate their children to live in a better world. So my question is, why will nobody take it on board?
I can respond briefly. I mean, in terms of how that impacts on the particular issues of refugees, I mean, clearly where you have large numbers of people living in great poverty, particularly large numbers of young people living in great poverty, then I think you do find political structures tend to become less stable. Those societies, particularly if they can't find gainful employment and work and prosperity for people, those societies become less stable. And so I'm sure that where you've got very dense populations in relatively poor land and poor situations, that doesn't help keep the kind of peace that prevents refugees arising in the first place. But I think issues around birth control, population control are very tricky ones. What we tend to find, of course, as populations become more wealthy, is that the family sizes go down. But in very poor populations, you do, where there are not good pension rights, you need more children in order to ensure that enough of them will survive to maintain you in your old age. I think there are also obviously some denominations, some faiths have particular issues around birth control. Mine doesn't. But I think clearly there is a link between poverty and war and terror and refugees.
Okay, we will do.
Thank you. Look at that.
Yeah, and if people would like to know more about population matters, there. Barbara.
To those here among us who actually believe that Christians have an obligation to help anyone that needs it, wherever they are in the world, one of the problems in the refugee situation in the autumn was no one knew how to help, and no one knew how to mobilize that help. Could maybe both of you talk to how individuals and where individuals who want to help can go to do some good? Thank you.
I think that's a great question, and it's certainly one that we've been really struggling with as an organisation. I mean, we've worked for the last 6 years with young people, and I feel like it's only been in the last 6 months that I've been invited to speak at things like this, because normally it's such a struggle to get the message out there that there are people who are vulnerable and displaced and here. So at one level it's been a really exciting time because suddenly everyone wants to help. But the challenge we found, we've got 600 people who've got in touch saying, we'd like to mentor, we'd like to help. And actually, we've had to apologise a lot just for the fact that it's taken us a while to respond to some of those inquiries. We're a team of 9 people, mainly part-time. And we've had to scrabble around to really get the infrastructure in place even to respond to that. So I think that's by way of apology as well, that I'm sorry for the times that I know people want to help and haven't known how to. I think it's worth thinking about what it is that you feel you can particularly offer. I think all of us have different skills, different assets, different ways of getting involved. For some people it might be, we run educational mentoring programs, something like that might be a good option. For others it is a spare room, for others it is looking at local projects that are sending warm clothes to people in refugee camps. I'd say start looking at networks like Citizens UK or groups that are trying to pull together some of the things already going on where people are being mobilised and bringing those responses together. I think one thing that all of us can do, and that we certainly found is great, small organisations like us, we don't have fundraising teams or communications teams, and what we've really valued in the last few months is where people have kind of almost got on side and helped get positive messages out, because it's so easy to hear negative stories in the press, and we've been really encouraged by just seeing everyone deciding that actually I might not be able to host a refugee or give lots of money, but I can choose to share one positive story on my Facebook page every week, or at a dinner party I can think, what story would I tell that is going against that prevailing narrative? Sorry, that's a bit of a not addressing everything, but I hope that helps.
Yeah. I think that largely covers the things I would have said. I'd reiterate the volunteers working, befriending people in language classes and working with existing refugee organisations where they're around, because they have the capacity. It's easier to build the capacity of existing organisations than create new organisations afresh. And even when this particular crisis is over, we will need those refugee organisations still with us in this country. There will still be a job for them to do. So people volunteering, working with those organisations, that's the way forward.
I too would want to endorse that. There are organisations out there, and as Barbara said, how do Christians respond? Christians do tend to have a tendency to invent new responses, not realising maybe responses are already there. Gentleman at the front, and then I'll come to you.
My name is Chris Quintifer. Am I heard? I'm from Spare Room for Forced Destitute Migrants. One way some people, if you happen to have a spare room, and I appreciate that in London it's less common than it is in other parts of the country, is to offer hospitality to somebody who is otherwise without a home, without a means of support, and has probably suffered terrible trauma in fleeing their own homes, their own culture. Perhaps they've risked their lives trying to cross the Mediterranean or living in the open in Calais. we're in a church here. Jesus said, "When I was a stranger, you took me in." That is, I think, a challenge. When I was a stranger, you took me in. That is what Spare Room attempts to do to those people who have no other means of support.
Do you have a question? Sorry, just a quick question.
Well, I suppose I'm really asking, can we not show compassion and hospitality to those who haven't chosen to come here? They are forced by war, by persecution, and also by environmental disaster. Yeah. If I may just mention the other organisation, which is London Hosting, which can be found through Housing Justice, which is a wider organisation than my own.
David? The question was around, is there possibility for people to offer accommodation or to welcome the stranger in? And then there was two organisations, London Hostings, which is through Housing Justice, and Spare Room for destitute migrants. So see the gentleman at the end, over the drinks.
I think these are just the examples of the sort of organisations' responses that people can make. Not everything is suitable for everybody, and I know that from my own conversations with the Minister for the Syrian Refugee Programme, he's very keen that as soon as people get to this country, given the trauma that they've been through when they arrive, that they probably need self-contained accommodation very, very quickly, certainly for that first year, and to be in a settled place for 12 months before we then think about possible move-on accommodation for them. But certainly those sort of initiatives are very welcome. Thank you.
John, just to add a little bit into that, if I may, one of the questions that sometimes comes out, if people are prepared to offer a space for a refugee, where was their offer with our current levels of youngsters who are not fostered and stuff? And so that's something that in my previous charity we wrestled with as we did that kind of support work. And one of the reflections that somebody told me once was, you don't hear foster parents saying we shouldn't be welcoming refugees in. They are already being active. So maybe for some, Syria has been a prompt that might awaken something of hospitality within them, that it may not actually be to offer it to refugees, it might be they become a foster parent. But that may have been the catalyst to start it. But either way, there does seem to be some movements there. Could I ask the gentleman question? Oh, yes, you, sir. Thank you.
My name is Roy Crowder from the Methodist Church. It's a question for the Bishop. You talked about the proposal of the bishops for the 50,000 figure. Could you explain something about that proposal, where it's got to, what sort of strategy there is about developing it, whether other churches are being invited to work along with it, that kind of thing?
Thank you. I mean, that was our attempt to look at a figure that would be realistic, that would not be more than our society could cope with, but would make a measurable impact on the most vulnerable of those who are particularly in the refugee camps around Syria. We're continuing to engage with government around the size of the refugee programme, particularly looking at the moment at issues around where people can kind of, if it's possible to sponsor refugees, whether that can be done additionally to the 20,000 that are currently being included in the government's programme. I think we just need to see how things. I think we're slightly disappointed how slowly the programme has started. To only have got 1,000 people here by Christmas, given so many people have been struggling in those camps for so long. And one of the things we're keen to do is to stop people making that dangerous sea crossing to get to Europe. And so a realistic way of the most vulnerable being taken straight from the camps to a place of permanent safety and security. We think if that's done to a realistic number, then that will act as dissuasion from people trying to make that perilous crossing. I think Save the Children estimated last year that something between 2,000 and 3,000 children would be likely to die making that crossing. One particularly young boy's picture became very famous. Ironically, his name was Alan, the same name as the taxi driver from Manchester, from Salford, where I live, Alan Henning, who was executed by ISIS for wanting to help Syrian children earlier last year. And so the last year for me was very much a tale of two Alans, both of whom lost their lives. One a refugee, one seeking to help those who were going to become refugees.
The gentleman over here, then I'll come to the middle. Just ask the gentleman there, you had a hand up, then I'll come to you next, sir. That's okay? Just over in the corner over there.
Thank you. My question is for the bishop, but probably for everyone else in the room. And it's a question that's on the front page of the leaflet that we're given today of who have we become and how do we use this crisis that we're going through at the moment to reflect on what we've become as a nation, as a people who can't kind of have empathy for other human beings in the world, as a community who can't remember back less than 100 years ago to when such a horrible, similar thing was happening, and to a country that's run by a media who spout lies to sell newspapers that ultimately, unfortunately, drive opinions that we have to have shout in our ear.
So who have we become is your question?
So the question is more, not only for everyone to reflect on who have we become, but how do we use situations like this to reflect as a society on who we've become?
Yeah. I think situations like this do make us go to whatever our core values are and to try to understand what are the things that are really important, what do we believe. For me, those core values are to be found in the Christian faith. Other people will find them in other faiths or in a secular philosophical value system as humanists or others. But it's important that we go back to those values and refound ourselves in them because these sorts of events challenge us very deeply. For me, at the core of this is that, as the Bible says, every man, woman, child is made in the image of God. And so when I look at you or anybody else, I'm looking at somebody who, like me, shares that image of God. You may speak a different language, you may come from a different part of the country, you may practice a different religion, but you are equally a loved child of God, as I believe myself to be. And so when I engage with you in your needs, I do so as a brother or a sister. And for me, that's at the heart of it. And these sorts of crises drive me back to those values. And they drive me to engage with people more face to face. So to engage with those who are refugees, to meet with those who are asylum seekers. One of our clergy in the Manchester diocese, he's been vicar there for about 40 years in his parish, much loved, has at any time up to about a dozen asylum seekers or refugees living in the vicarage and the church while he and his family support them through some very difficult and demanding processes. When I look at him, I very much see somebody made in the image of God.
When you were asking that, a situation recently came to mind when it was actually just before the general election when I was meeting with a young person at work from Afghanistan, and he had been seeing the news but not really understanding what was going on, and he just came into the office and said, I just want to talk because I don't quite understand. Does the government, do people hate me? What have I done wrong? And there was a real sense of knowing that the attitude wasn't great, but not really knowing what was being said and how to address that. And I think situations like that really have challenged me along similar lines to think about what are we becoming. And I think for me the most important thing is to be able to have dialogue like this, to reflect on that, because looking back at history and times in the past where horrific things have happened, it's never been an immediate thing. It's just been drip by drip over time as attitudes harden and certain things become normal. So there are things in our society like detention centres where certain migrants are essentially indefinitely detained without access to the process that other people would normally have access to. And it's just become quite normal that these things exist. So I think for me, what we can all take away is the idea of not only thinking ourselves about where we've become, what we've become, but having these conversations with each other, because I think conversations about values and about particularly where we feel our values are threatened or where we don't really know what the right answer is, the best thing we can do is keep having conversations so that things don't become normal without us questioning them.
I think we have time for one last question from the gentleman in the middle.
To the bishop. My name is Deji. I'm from the Methodist Church. Bear in mind that the refugee are the fourth victim of jihadist terrorism. And reflecting on the narratives from the Middle East uprising, when you look at the division between the Shiites and the Sunnis who are fighting, whereby most of these people are running away, what do you think the church can do? Because there are some research now, the Sunnis and Shiites are getting their ammunitions from somewhere to fight. And when the fighting continue, the refugee will continue to come. There's no amount of anything we can give to them until that war stops. Then the refugee will see, nobody wants to be a refugee. No. Home is home. But what is the church doing to stop some Western power supplying arms and ammunition to Sunni and Shiites so that this war can finish? And then nobody wants to come to any nation. Home is home.
Yeah. And you hit a nail fairly firmly on the head there, that much of the current refugee crisis is a result of war, war that is being fought in Syria, but not only supplied by nations far away from Syria, the West, Russia, but actually with those nations taking part in events which themselves lead to more people fleeing for their lives. I've long held the view that when we as a nation intervene, possibly for the best of all possible reasons, in affairs in another nation, then we have a responsibility that goes on after that to, effectively, if we make a mess, we clean it up. And many of the refugees now are a result of British interventions in other parts of the world in former times, not simply over these last few years, but before that. So I think that's a very important factor. You mentioned about some of the divisions within different groups within Islam. Most world religions have had some experience of war between different groups, whether it's Protestants and Catholics in Europe in the 16th century or what we're seeing more recently. What we can do is to build strong, healthy, wholesome relationships with the different religious groups who share our living space with us. I convene the Greater Manchester Faith Leaders Group that meets in my house every couple of months, and that brings together the leaders and representatives of all the major faiths, Jewish, Hindu, Sikh, Jain, Muslim, Christian denominations, and we're learning to live in harmony with one another and to support each other as people of faith living our lives in the one and the same city. The ways that we can meet others unlike ourselves, different faiths, and build relationships, not just bilateral but multilateral with those different groups, I think that helps. If we can demonstrate here how to live in harmony across those differences, that can only be a force for good in other places.
Okay, that's the, time has gone from us. That's the end of our Q&A, but both of our panellists will be around for the drinks afterwards for further conversations. What I'd like to do is invite both of them just to come up to give some closing remarks for 1 or 2 minutes. The first one will be Emily, if you'd like to come up with your closing thoughts from this evening.
I think, first of all, I'm aware that there are some people who probably had questions that they didn't have time to ask, so do feel free to come and talk to us afterwards and to voice those. I think by way of closing, I just would like to repeat what that young person said to me earlier in the week when he said, tell them that one person alone can't do everything, but it's important that everyone does something. And I think that would probably be my challenge to each of us, including myself tonight, would be to go away and think about what we can do, while recognising that we can't do everything, thinking about within our power and our own context what we can do. And I think recently I've been watching the floods in the north of England on the news, and in some ways thinking that it's quite similar to the refugee crisis. It's just one of those things that has happened, and people have been displaced from their homes. No one could really have prepared for the scale of it. And what happened was people just mobilised, and they've helped their neighbours out, they've offered them warm homes to stay in, they've just responded, they've dealt with the immediate need. And then, of course, we go on to talk about the policy, and we talk about the fact that perhaps some of it could have been prevented and things could be put in place to stop it happening in the future. And so as I've thought about the floods and watched those, I've kind of thought if only we could see ourselves doing more of that with refugees as well. Although these are people coming from different countries, they're still people in need, and we need to start by responding to those needs in front of us, but also engaging in the policies that affect them. I'm aware that there are lots of people here who probably still do want to help and are wondering how to do that. And I'd like to say, please do come and see me or get in touch, because even if we as an organisation can't do something to link you up with what you'd like to do, I'd love to be able to signpost you elsewhere. But I suppose each of us can also go away and think about the language we use. And I'd probably challenge each of us to do that, to think about how we can be generous in how we speak about people, so that when we talk about refugees, we're doing so with compassion and in a way that values people's humanity and what they have in common with us.
I live in a part of Salford where most of my neighbours are Jewish. There's a long tradition of Jews living in that part of Salford. They came to Manchester, many of them originally as refugees. They came, they brought the skills that they had. They were an important part of our fabric trade over many generations. Other groups have come since. They brought their own skills. They've contributed to our society. I think our primary task is to enable those who arrive here initially in fear and trembling, having fled for their lives, deeply traumatized, to help them, as previous generations of refugees have done, to become the valuable and loved citizens who help build this nation into the nation that we want it to be. Thank you.
So just leaves for me to close this evening. Thank you all for being with us. It's been a good conversation we've had all evening. If you want to keep those conversations going, please do over refreshments. Can we just give our two guests, Emily and Bishop David, a final round of applause and say thank you very much for contributing?